Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt. We now turn to the poem Beginning My Studies, which I think makes a lot of sense for a Talks with Walt series where we're working through every one of the poems of Leaves of Grass. This is, of course, poem 10 of the 24 poems of inscriptions, those poems that we kind of qualify as preface poems, right? Giving some kind of sense of what the entire text of Leaves of Grass is going to be about. Hey, put this in your notes. In beginning my studies, and certainly kind of dovetailing with when I read the book, the poem that we just worked with, and the poem to follow, Beginners, here we're talking with Genesis. Now, I don't mean Genesis as in the first book of the Bible, although certainly that will work in the beginning. Notice here, beginning my studies. But I mean the roots of everything that will constitute Whitman's life. Why? Well, let's go to some assumptions. Again, as we always do with these lectures, I love to come back to the original objectives. I want to remind us again and again why we are here. It's not enough to just read the words, guys. We got to try and challenge ourselves with a few assumptions now here. My first is that at LearnStrong.net you've been following all of our previous lectures. So if, for example, you stumble onto this lecture and you haven't been looking at the other ones, it might make sense to go back and study some of that previous stuff at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side there, Talks with Walt is the folder. Why? Because we are the stories that we tell and retell. We're also the stories we decide to accept and reject. And of course, if you think about that mantra as being so important in 303, then when did you learn the stories? And how did you learn the stories? And how do you relearn the stories? There are some readers who pick up Leaves of Grass many, many years later in their life, and I hope that's some of you, who are picking up these poems to read them again and again, to come back to them and say, these are some interesting stories. Of course, our learning theory is also central. Can we connect new information to old information in meaningful ways? Because the new NEW is the new KNEW. Everything's built. Everything is built on the past, and that's important because you can't reject a story if you don't know that story, right? Of course, our annotation approach is important for us at level 1. What does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, rhetorical kinds of techniques and poetic techniques. And finally, at level 3, how can I relate to this information? First, to other texts that we're working with. Notice, for example, I just made the observation that if you really want to understand this poem, you kind of need to know a little bit about the poem that came before when I read the book, and the poem to follow, Beginners, because we're dealing with this idea of Genesis, the beginning of it all, and that makes sense in a preface-like inscription section. And then finally, can I relate to this information in some personal way? I want to own each of these titles in some small way. Can I write down at least one thing I want to try to hold on to, remember, and then later in Leaves of Grass, I promise this is the way it's going to happen, because Whitman intentionally constructed with his some 6 to 9 different editions of Leaves of Grass, and the constant editing and tinkering that went on, he's definitely constructing a final work, and that final work will have all kinds of permeations from inscriptions. Studying these first 24 poems will help you read the rest of the poems in Leaves of Grass, all right? We assume as well that you have some knowledge of our Big Five, as we refer to it in 303. What does the text say about epistemology, what you can know, and especially the fallibilist position, as opposed to the absolutist position or the relativist position? Absolutely, I know I'm right, you're wrong, no question. Or the relativist position, there is no truth at all, which sounds like a truth, and therefore the performative contradiction. The fallibilist position about an epistemological certainty, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That will be significant to reading this poem and the one to follow. Why? Because for Whitman, his education taught him that epistemologically, the fallibilist position makes the most sense, which is obviously the position of science when it is not scientism. That is to say, I got a hypothesis, I could be wrong about it though. I got to test it and I got to, validate it in some way. What do these texts say, number 2, about our Big Five? Ontology and who we are. Think of it this way from our study of Plato. Go back and look at those lectures again for public. You remember what Socrates said, you are your education. You're not just your education, you're the education of all the people that came before you as well. Somehow it's all there in your spiritual DNA, your intellectual cognitive DNA. To that degree, ontologically, who are you? When you say you are your education. We're going to have something to say about that in this poem. And then, of course, psychology and sociology are the next 2 of our Big Five, the study of the individual mind, the collective mind, and then finally, of course, the question of pain, suffering in the world, theodicy, right? Why did this happen for me? Not why did this happen to me? Our last assumption, so that you're familiar with our 5 Ps, as we call it, the perspectives on Whitman. Whitman is person. Clearly, we're going to play that game here because he's going to talk about his own education and his studying. Whitman is poet. Whitman is pedagogue. That's huge for this because Whitman started out as a teacher, and I think he remained always in his life interested in education and in teaching. Whitman is politician in his love of democracy. Whitman is philosopher, thinker, profound thinker from the pre-Socratics, obviously through the time of Emerson and the great thinkers there. Now, the background information here is that this first appearance happens in Drum Taps in 1865, but ultimately by 1871 we have the final version here. Let's go ahead and work with the beginning my studies. And obviously the moment that we read my studies, we think of Francis Bacon's Of Studies. Studies are good for, go back and look at that lecture again, right? Studies are good for 3 things he tells us there, right? That is to say, they're good for being alone, right? When retirement, as he will call it, right? Studies are good for ostentation, for ornament, and of course for ability. So here we're playing a similar kind of game. Beginning my studies. Beginning my studies, the first step pleased me so much. The mere fact, consciousness, these forms, the power of motion, the least insect or animal, the senses, eyesight, love. The first step, I say, on me and pleased me so much. I've hardly gone and hardly wish to go any further, but stop and loiter all the time to sing it in ecstatic songs. Now, of course, there's a reason why teachers and educators love Whitman, because he's always talking about education. He's always talking about learning and this desire to always connect new information to old information in profound and in meaningful ways. Notice he says at the very beginning my studies, the first step, and we immediately think of our Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Pleased me, by the way, notice the elided verbs here that try and capture again that resonance of American vernacular speech. So we're going to drop the E and have the apostrophe between S and D for pleased. Pleased me so much. This pleasure that Whitman gains from learning is one that I hope we can capture a little bit in our talks with Walt. He loves it. He loves to talk about all the things. I mean, he'll say it in 48, passage 48, A Song of Myself. To glance with an eye or show a bean in its pod confounds the learning of old time. He's just giddy about the fact there's something new to be learned. How about this? Wake up every morning and say, today at least I'm going to learn one new thing. And the great Leo Biscaglia loves to tell that story about how his father bought that encyclopedia set, and they all had to go and look in it before they would sit down to eat in the evening, because the father would demand of each of the numerous children in the family, one thing you learned today you didn't know. Wow, what a great way to start out supper. I mean, after the formalities of how the day went, it's probably not a bad question to ask those you care about as you're raising them, that you're trying to educate them and obviously yourself. What's something new you learned today that you didn't know yesterday? And if you didn't learn anything new today, whose fault is that? You can't blame it on a teacher, because you're in charge of your own life and your own education, right? He says, I became so pleased so much. The mere, notice the use of the word mere here is the epistemological fallibilist position. The mere fact, consciousness, we've said it before, it's such an amazing thing to recognize. I am thinking. Hurrah! I am aware that I am thinking. Whoa, wait. That does not make any sense. I can think a thought. The mind is doing that. Well, then what is it that's aware that my mind is thinking? What is it that stands behind my mind and lets me know, dude, you're thinking right now? What is that? It clearly can't be the mind. The eyeball can't see itself. That's what we learned in our study of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Well, then what is that? Here the word will be consciousness. What is that? What does it mean to be self-aware? The moment you stumble onto that, you cannot help but be just kind of blown away by that fact. That is incredible. If I have that capacity, do all other humans on this planet have that capacity? The moment I make that recognition, I am moving from an egocentric to an ethnocentric moral stance. And he says, the first time I stumbled onto the idea of consciousness, it blew my ever-loving mind. No pun intended, right? Or maybe pun intended. He says, the mere fact consciousness. And here the word fact, we have to think about our Thoreau and Walden, and we must learn to reawaken, he says in that part too. We talked about this in detail elsewhere. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. And then he says that, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability, right? The unquestionable ability. That ability to what? Well, to somehow further our lives, to perfect our lives through some kind of conscious endeavor. That's what Thoreau says. Whitman, heavily influenced by this idea. Notice he calls it a fact, the mere fact of consciousness. You have to have a mind to argue there is no mind. Think about it. These, and then he uses the Platonist term forms. We talked about that in our discussion of eidolons. The power of motion. It's amazing, isn't it? Everything moves. Everything is here. We think of those opening lines of Ken Wilber's Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. Why is there something instead of nothing, right? The power of motion. The least insect or animal. Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. He prayeth well, who loveth well, both man and bird in peace. He playeth best who loveth best. All things, both great and small. Right? For the dear God loveth all, he made to loveth all. That idea that there is nothing insignificant. Everything is important in Leaves of Grass. Write it down. It'll come back, of course. No, obviously the senses. We're very interested in that. Eyesight blows his mind. Why wouldn't it? To glance with an eye or show a bean in his pod confounds the learning of all time, he'll say in passage 48, right? Later, a song of myself. Love. What an amazing list he's giving to us here. When you stumble onto these things, whether from biology, from sociology, from any of the other ologies that are at the university, I cannot understand why students are not ecstatic every day. They wake up in their dorm room and go, today I get to go and learn new things. If that is not your attitude, check it. And Whitman says, check it. Go back to the beginning of your studies, when a dandelion was something worth studying and playing with at the park, because it blew your mind. Why can't we rediscover that again? Whitman says, well, I think you can. Notice he says it. The first step, the Genesis, right? I say, awed me. I think awed here is an important word. It's about respect. It is central to how you read Leaves of Grass. He is awed by a spring of summer grass, as he will say. He's awed by just looking at the world and being blown away by it. And pleased me. Notice he comes back to this word pleased. So much I have hardly gone and hardly wish to go any further. Now, obviously, this is Whitman at his, kind of like hyperbolic best, because obviously he went a whole lot beyond it. But he says, the first steps were so amazing. I just found myself stunned, and I continue to be stunned by the majesty and the curiosity and the wonder of this world. How can you not be? In spite or even because of all the pain and suffering. It's quite a remarkable thing. But he says, I find myself wanting to stop and loiter. Later it will be the word loaf. This means muse. And now we're back to the ancient Greek tradition. This is the idea of always daydreaming, always, I want to spend more time, right? I want to spend more time. All the time, he says, I want to sing about this in ecstatic songs. Now, coming out of that interesting Quaker background, the word ecstatic carries with it multiple importances. In other words, I want to tell people, but you can capture this. When you play that great video game for the first time, what is it you want to do? Share it with somebody. You want to talk about it. First time you hear a great song, you want to talk about it with somebody. First time you watch a great film on Netflix or at the theater or whatever, what do you want to do? You want to share it with somebody. This is the nature of what it means to be human at the sociological level. Why? Because as Vygotsky said, when you are moved out of that zone of proximal development cognitively right to the border, and you're challenged in some way, you want to share that with somebody. It excites you, ecstatic. You're excited by it. It blows you away. And Whitman says, I can't get over the fact. And I'm amazed that he writes this whole poem without an exclamation point, because that's kind of his MO, is to try and capture it. But notice he uses the language at 2B, and so he doesn't use the exclamation point to say, I'm just blown away, I'm awed. And it's what we have said, as we say we are the stories we tell and retell. It isn't that we like or dislike texts. We get to that later, maybe. Can we respect? Can we appreciate? Can we see how it works? We can read texts we don't agree with and still be in awe, blown away. And even if it doesn't move us, well, it moved a whole lot of people to have made it this long, probably should pick it up, probably should take a look at it. This is why, for example, we love the work of Jordan Peterson, for example, in those lectures in the opening chapters of the Bible itself, the book of Genesis. What is happening there? He's trying to find some sense of awe, reverence for that text. Don't have to agree with it, but you can be blown away by it. It's an attitude. Well, it's finished now at 2A. Obviously, it is an attitude. Learning is, of course, an attitude. It's a great joy. It's the greatest joy, right? Great things often happen from small beginnings, as well as another major message here. Of course, notice this poem placed intentionally at the very beginning of Leaves of Grass. At 2B, well, note again all of the elided verbs here, the capturing of the American vernacular, the repetitions for emphases that are happening here. We're going to see that more and more. At 3A, I've mentioned so many titles already. The Learned Astronomer is the one, though, I want you to write down, because when we come back to it, we're going to remind ourselves that this was the genesis of that poem in many ways, right? Of course, Plato's Republic and the notion of fear and pain and the importance of that cave allegory lecture. Go back to Eidolons, where I talk a little bit about Plato in that regards. I've mentioned, obviously, other great biographies and autobiographies that will constitute the fundamentals of learning. I mean, you want to learn about education? Read Booker T. Washington. You want to learn about education? Read Frederick Douglass. And there you will find what education actually looks like. And what is the argument that Frederick Douglass makes, as I've said in other lectures on Douglass. He's arguing, if you can't learn to learn, you're a slave all your life. It isn't about chains alone. It's about intellectual chains. It's about the inability to free oneself through one's learning. There is the key. And by the way, that is the solution to the problem sociologically. It is education. It is to have the courage to wrestle with ideas that upset you, and yet somehow to break free of the stories and form new stories has to happen through an education. And finally, 3B, and our hope here obviously is that you'll begin to take your education more seriously, your learning more seriously from reading a poem like this. How about this one? What is for you the most exciting thing you ever learned, and why? And can you remember and can you capture what that was like? We talk about it, obviously, when I taught my son to ride a bike. That learning to ride a bike, so compelling, because for most of us, we didn't want to fall once we took those training wheels off. But falling is part of learning to ride a bike, for most of us anyway, and therefore overcoming that fear because of the pain, right? And that leads us to our next question. Do you think you can learn without fear and pain? Can learning just be pure, sheer joy? Whitman obviously is static, emphasizing the joy of it. And yet we know that learning constitutes a lot of, again, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. We go right there to the borderline and we're pushed beyond it, and we're a little bit discombobulated cognitively. And it's at that point that teacher becomes destroyer, right? And disturber. And Whitman loves to play that game. How about this one? What are you most curious about right now in your life? What excites you? About what are you ecstatic? Well, I hope that in some ways you're ecstatic about these conversations with Walt, and we will continue. Thank you.